A millionaire disguises herself as a cook and enters her own restaurant, but no one knows who she is. She is horrified when something happens. Sarah Thompson looked in the mirror one last time, adjusting the chef's hat over her carefully tied brown hair. At 30 years old, the successful entrepreneur and owner of the Golden Kitchen restaurant chain was about to embark on the riskiest adventure of her life. With a deep sigh, she reminded herself why she was doing this: declining quality reports, customer complaints, and the persistent feeling that something was wrong at the heart of her culinary empire. "It's time to uncover the truth," she muttered to herself, taking one last glance at her reflection. She was no longer Sarah Thompson, the millionaire restaurant owner. Now she was simply Sarah, a novice cook looking for work. With determined steps, Sarah left her luxurious apartment and headed towards one of her most problematic restaurants. The plan was simple but bold: infiltrate as just another employee, experience the daily challenges firsthand, and discover the root of the problems affecting her business. Upon arriving at the restaurant, Sarah felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. The bustle of the kitchen, the aroma of spices, and the sound of utensils clashing against each other greeted her like a familiar yet strange symphony. For the first time, she was on the other side of the line, not as the boss, but as an aspiring cook. "Are you the new one?" asked a gruff voice. Sarah turned to find herself face to face with Jack, the head chef. His scrutinizing gaze made her feel instantly uncomfortable. "Yes, I'm Sarah. I'm here for the assistant cook position," she responded, trying to maintain her composure. Jack looked her up and down with disdain. "Fine, but let's be clear. We don't tolerate mistakes here. If you can't keep up, the door's right there," he snapped, pointing towards the exit. Sarah nodded, biting her tongue to avoid responding. This was exactly the kind of attitude she wanted to observe and change. As Jack assigned her first task, peeling a mountain of potatoes, Sarah noticed the tension in the atmosphere. The cooks worked in silence, with expressions of stress and fatigue. It wasn't the vibrant and passionate environment she had imagined for her restaurants. Suddenly, the kitchen door burst open, and in walked Robert, the restaurant manager. His presence seemed to tense the atmosphere even more. Come on, move faster! Do you think the customers are going to wait all day?" Robert shouted, his voice resonating throughout the kitchen. Sarah observed how the employees cowered at his words, nervously speeding up their movements. It was then that her eyes met those of a young sous chef who gave her a look of sympathy. "I'm Emily," whispered the young woman, approaching Sarah while pretending to look for something on a nearby shelf. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it, or you'll run away like the others." Those words resonated in Sarah's mind. How many good employees had she lost due to this toxic environment? It was clear that she had a lot of work ahead of her, but she was more determined than ever to unravel the problems and transform her beloved Golden Kitchen into the place she had always dreamed it would be. As she peeled the potatoes, Sarah began to mentally outline her plan. She would observe, learn, and gradually try to implement subtle changes. It wouldn't be easy, but she was willing to face any challenge that stood in her way. What Sarah didn't know was that the biggest challenge of all was about to walk through the kitchen door, in the form of a talented chef named Ethan, who would not only test her skills as a businesswoman, but also her heart. Sarah's second day in the kitchen began with a frenzy of activity. Orders came in non-stop, and the team struggled to keep up. Jack barked orders left and right, while Robert prowled around the kitchen, his critical gaze increasing the pressure on everyone. Sarah moved as fast as she could, trying not to make mistakes while cutting vegetables and preparing garnishes. Her hands, unaccustomed to this intense work, already showed blisters, but she refused to complain. She was determined to experience everything her employees faced daily. In the midst of the chaos, the kitchen door suddenly opened. A tall, handsome man with hazel eyes and an air of confidence entered with a firm step. Sarah couldn't help but notice how his presence seemed to instantly change the atmosphere of the kitchen. "Ethan!" exclaimed Robert, his tone changing from irritation to false enthusiasm. "What a surprise to have you here." Ethan, the star chef from another branch of Golden Kitchen, smiled cordially. "The head office sent me to supervise and help with some improvements," he explained. his gaze scanning the kitchen until it rested on Sarah. For a moment, Sarah feared being recognized, but Ethan simply gave her a kind smile before turning to Jack and Robert. "How about if I observe for a bit, and then we talk about possible changes?" he suggested. Jack frowned, clearly annoyed by the intrusion into his domain, while Robert nodded with forced enthusiasm. Sarah, for her part, couldn't take her eyes off Ethan. There was something about him, a mix of professionalism and passion that intrigued her deeply. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed how Ethan moved through the kitchen, observing, asking subtle questions, and occasionally offering advice to the cooks. His approach was completely different from Jack's, where Jack criticized, Ethan patiently guided. During a brief break, Sarah found herself near Ethan as they both poured themselves a glass of water. "You're new here, aren't you?" he asked with a warm smile. Sarah nodded, feeling an inexplicable nervousness. "Yes, I started yesterday. I'm Sarah." "Ethan," he introduced himself, extending his hand. As she shook it, Sarah felt a spark of electricity that took her by surprise. "How's the kitchen treating you so far?" he asked with genuine interest. Before Sarah could respond, Robert's strident voice interrupted the moment. "Hey, you, the new one, less chatting and more work." "I don't pay you to flirt." Sarah felt her cheeks flush, both from embarrassment and contained anger. Ethan frowned at Robert's comment, but before he could say anything, Sarah had already returned to her workstation. Throughout the day, Sarah couldn't help but notice the occasional glances Ethan threw her way. Every time their eyes met, she felt a mix of excitement and guilt. How could she be developing feelings for someone when she was there under a false identity? At the end of the shift, as everyone cleaned their stations, Ethan approached Sarah again. "You did a great job today," he commented. "It's clear you have a passion for cooking." Sarah smiled, genuinely flattered. "Thank you. I've always loved cooking, although I still have a lot to learn." Ethan nodded understandingly. "We're all constantly learning. That's the beauty of this craft." He paused, as if considering something, and then added, "You know, I'm thinking of organizing some training sessions for the team. I'd love for you to participate." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. On one hand, she was excited about the opportunity to learn more and spend time with Ethan. On the other, she knew that each interaction deepened the lie she was living. "I'd love to," she finally responded, deciding that the opportunity to improve the team's skills was worth the risk. As Sarah prepared to leave, she couldn't help but reflect on the day's events. She had come to uncover the problems in her restaurant, but instead, she was discovering feelings she hadn't experienced in years. Ethan represented everything she valued in a leader: passion, empathy, and a genuine desire to improve. However, as she walked to her apartment, a feeling of unease settled in her stomach. How would Ethan react when he discovered her true identity? Would he see her disguise as a betrayal or understand her motives? Sarah knew she was walking a very fine line. Each day she spent in the kitchen, each interaction with Ethan, brought her closer to an inevitable revelation. She only hoped she would have the strength to face the consequences when the time came. With these thoughts swirling in her mind, Sarah promised herself to stay focused on her original mission. But even as she made this promise, she couldn't help but let a small smile form on her lips at the thought of seeing Ethan again the next day. As the days passed, Sarah found herself increasingly immersed in her role as a novice cook. Her hands, once soft and delicate, now showed the marks of hard work. Small cuts, incipient calluses, and minor burns. But far from bothering her, these marks had become a tangible reminder of her mission and the experiences she was living. One morning, as she prepared the mise en place for the lunch service, Emily approached her with a look of complicity. "Hey, Sarah," she whispered, making sure no one else could hear them. "I've been thinking about some ideas to improve our menu. Would you like to take a look after the shift?" Sarah felt a wave of excitement. This was exactly the kind of initiative she had always hoped to see in her employees. "Of course," she responded enthusiastically. "I'd love to." However, their conversation was abruptly interrupted by Jack's harsh voice. "You two, Do I pay you to chat? Get back to work." Emily and Sarah exchanged looks of frustration before returning to their tasks, but the seed of collaboration had already been planted. Later that day, Ethan reappeared in the kitchen. His presence, as always, brought with it a mix of nervousness and anticipation for Sarah. She watched as he interacted with the team, offering advice and words of encouragement. It was a stark contrast to Jack and Robert's leadership style. At one point, Ethan approached Sarah's station. "How's everything going here?" he asked with a warm smile. Sarah felt her heart race. "Good, thank you. Although there's always room for improvement," she responded, thinking of Emily's ideas. Ethan nodded, his expression turning serious. "You know, I've noticed you have a good eye for detail. Have you considered proposing some ideas to improve processes?" For a moment, Sarah was speechless. Here was Ethan, encouraging her to do exactly what she, as the owner, had always wanted her employees to do. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. "Actually," she began, deciding to take the risk, "Emily and I have been talking about some ideas for the menu." Ethan's eyes lit up. "That's fantastic. I'd love to hear those ideas. How about the three of us meet after the shift?" Sarah nodded enthusiastically, but her joy was quickly dampened when she noticed Robert's glaring look from across the kitchen. It was evident that he didn't approve of this camaraderie between Ethan and the rest of the staff. At the end of the shift, Sarah, Emily, and Ethan met in a quiet corner of the restaurant. Emily unfolded her notes, revealing a series of innovative ideas for dishes that would combine the traditional flavors of a golden kitchen with modern techniques and more elegant presentations. Sarah was impressed. As the restaurant owner, she had always sought this kind of creativity and initiative in her team. Seeing Emily present these ideas with such passion reminded her why she had started this business in the first place. Ethan listened attentively, asking insightful questions and offering constructive suggestions. His enthusiasm was contagious, and soon the three were immersed in an animated discussion about culinary possibilities. "This is exactly the kind of innovation we need," Ethan declared with a smile. "What do you say we prepare some of these dishes as specials for next week? We could present them to Jack and Robert as a test." Sarah and Emily exchanged looks of excitement. It was more than they had hoped for. "Do you really think we could do it?" asked Emily, her voice mixed with hope and nervousness. Ethan nodded with conviction. "Absolutely. You have brilliant ideas and deserve to be heard. Besides," he added, looking directly at Sarah, "I think you make a great team." Sarah felt her cheeks flush under Ethan's intense gaze. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel seen and valued, not just as a cook, but as a person. "Thank you." "Ethan," said Sarah, trying to maintain her composure, "it means a lot to us to have your support." As they gathered their things to leave, Ethan approached Sarah. "You know," he began, his voice low and warm, "there's something special about you, Sarah. You have a vision for cooking that goes beyond simply following recipes. It's as if you understand the heart of what we do here." Sarah felt her heart racing. For a moment, she feared that Ethan had discovered her true identity, but his next comment reassured her. "You remind me of someone," Ethan continued, his gaze lost in the distance. "The owner of this chain, Sarah Thompson. I've never met her in person, but I've heard about her passion for cooking and her vision for these restaurants. I think you two would get along well." Sarah had to stifle a nervous laugh. If Ethan only knew the truth. But instead, she simply smiled and said, "She sounds like an interesting person. I'd love to meet her someday." As she walked to her apartment that night, Sarah felt conflicted. On one hand, she was excited about the progress they were making and the connection she was forming with Ethan. On the other hand, the guilt over her deception began to weigh more and more heavily. In the following days, Sarah, Emily, and Ethan worked secretly on the new dishes. They took advantage of every free moment, often staying after their shifts to experiment with flavors and presentations. However, their enthusiasm did not go unnoticed. Jack began to look at them with suspicion, and Robert seemed increasingly irritated by Ethan's constant presence in the kitchen. One afternoon, while Sarah and Emily were testing a new dessert, Robert approached them with a frown. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice laden with authority. "This isn't an experiment lab. We have an established menu for a reason." Sarah was about to respond when Ethan appeared behind Robert. "Actually, Robert," he said calmly, "I asked them to work on these new ideas. I think they could be a great boost for the restaurant." Robert turned to Ethan, his face flushed with anger. "And who do you think you are to make those decisions? I'm the manager here, and I say we stick to the current menu." The tension in the kitchen was palpable. All the employees had stopped working to observe the confrontation. Sarah felt a mix of frustration and determination. As the owner, she knew she had the power to end this discussion, but as Sarah the cook, she had to find another way to handle the situation. "Mr. Robert," she began, her voice firm but respectful, "I understand your concern, but don't you think it's worth at least trying these ideas? If they don't work, we can always go back to the original menu." Robert looked at her with disdain. "And who are you to give an opinion? You've barely been here a few weeks." It was then that Jack, to everyone's surprise, intervened. "I hate to admit it," he said, his voice as gruff as ever, "but the girl is right. It won't hurt us to try something new." Jack's unexpected support seemed to throw Robert off balance. He looked around, noticing the expectant looks of all the kitchen staff. Finally, with a sigh of defeat, he nodded. "Fine. You have 1 week to prepare and present these new dishes, but if they don't impress, we'll go back to the original menu, and I don't want to hear any more about changes. Understood?" As Robert walked away, Sarah exchanged looks of triumph with Emily and Ethan. They had won a small battle, but they knew the real test was yet to come. That night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she reflected on the day's events. She was proud of how she had handled the situation, but she also knew she was walking a very fine line. The more involved she became in the kitchen, the closer she felt to Ethan, the harder it would be to reveal the truth. With a sigh, Sarah promised herself that no matter what, she would find a way to do the right thing, both for her restaurant and for the people she had come to care about. With that thought in mind, she fell asleep, dreaming of new flavors and endless possibilities. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Sarah arrived at the restaurant. The week Robert had given them to prepare and present the new dishes was coming to an end, and the tension in the kitchen was palpable. Emily was already there, her eyes tired but bright with determination. "Good morning," she greeted Sarah with a nervous smile. "Ready for the big day?" Sarah nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and anxiety in her stomach. "As ready as we can be," she replied, putting on her apron. As the rest of the staff arrived, the energy in the kitchen kept building. Everyone knew what was at stake, not just the possibility of introducing new dishes to the menu, but also a potential change in the power dynamics within the restaurant. Ethan arrived shortly after, his presence bringing a wave of calm and confidence. He approached Sarah and Emily, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "Remember," he said in a low voice, "you know these dishes better than anyone. Trust your instinct and your talent." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine at Ethan's touch. His closeness, his faith in them, gave her strength to face what was to come. Mid-morning, Robert and Jack entered the kitchen, followed by 2 men in suits that Sarah recognized as executives from the head office. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected the tasting to be so formal. "Well," announced Robert, his voice cutting through the kitchen's bustle like a knife, "let's see what you've prepared." For the next hour, Sarah and Emily presented dish after dish, explaining each element, each flavor, each technique used. Ethan was there, backing up their explanations and adding comments about how these new dishes could elevate the restaurant's reputation. The executives tasted each dish in silence, their expressions unreadable. Jack, to Sarah's surprise, seemed genuinely impressed with some of the creations. Robert, on the other hand, maintained an expression of skepticism throughout the presentation. Finally, after tasting the last dessert, an innovative deconstructed tiramisu that had been Sarah's idea, one of the executives spoke. "I must say," he began, wiping his mouth with a napkin, "that I'm pleasantly surprised. These dishes maintain the essence of Golden Kitchen, but take them to a completely new level. Sarah and Emily exchanged looks of contained excitement. Had they really done it? The other executive nodded in agreement. I think Mrs. Thompson would be very pleased with these innovations. In fact, I dare say this is exactly the kind of creativity she has always fostered in our restaurants. Sarah had to bite her lip to keep from smiling too much. If they only knew. Robert, however, didn't seem to share the enthusiasm. With all due respect, he interrupted, these dishes are too experimental. Our customers come here expecting certain flavors, certain presentations. We can't simply change everything overnight. No one has suggested changing the entire menu immediately, Ethan intervened, his voice calm but firm. We could introduce these dishes as specials, see how customers react. Jack, to everyone's surprise, nodded in agreement. I hate to admit it, but I think it's worth a try. These dishes, they're good. Really good. The tension in the kitchen was palpable as everyone waited for the final decision. Sarah could feel her heart beating hard. All her plan, all this experience, seemed to culminate in this moment. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, one of the executives spoke. I think we should give them a chance. We'll introduce these dishes as specials for a month and evaluate the customer response. The kitchen erupted in a mix of cheers and sighs of relief. Sarah felt like a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. They had done it. They had taken the first step towards the change she had always wanted for her restaurant. In the midst of the celebration, Sarah felt a hand on her back. She turned to find herself face to face with Ethan, his face lit up with a radiant smile. How you did it, he said softly, his eyes fixed on hers. I knew you could. For a moment, the world seemed to fade away around them. Sarah lost herself in the warmth of Ethan's gaze, in the sincerity of his words. She felt the almost irresistible urge to reveal everything to him, to tell him who she really was and why she was there. But before she could say anything, Robert interrupted the moment. Don't get too excited, he said, his voice laden with bitterness. This is just a test, and I'll be watching very closely to make sure it doesn't negatively affect our operations. Robert's words were like a cold shower, reminding Sarah of the reality of her situation. She still had a long way to go, and many obstacles to overcome. As the kitchen slowly returned to normal, Sarah found herself reflecting on her journey so far. She had come seeking to understand the problems in her restaurant, and in the process, she had found much more. Renewed passion, new friendships, and perhaps something deeper with Ethan, but with each step forward, the truth of her identity weighed more and more heavily on her. How would everyone react when they discovered who she really was? Would Ethan forgive her deception? With a mix of determination and apprehension, Sarah prepared to face the challenges that would come. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to see her mission through to the end, regardless of the personal cost. What she didn't know was that fate had some more surprises in store, and that her greatest test was yet to come. The weeks following the presentation of the new dishes were a whirlwind of activity at Golden Kitchen. The specials, as Sarah and Emily had dubbed them, quickly became the talk of the town among diners. Social media was buzzing with enthusiastic photos and reviews, his eyes shining with excitement. Can you stay a bit after your shift? Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Sure, she replied, trying to keep calm. What's it about? Ethan shook his head, his smile widening. You'll see. I promise. It'll be worth it. For the rest of her shift, Sarah couldn't help but speculate about Ethan's surprise. Had he gotten approval to make the new dishes permanent? Or maybe he had come up with new recipes he wanted them to try together. When the moment finally arrived, Ethan guided her to a small conference room in the back of the restaurant. Upon entering, Sarah gasped. The table was set for two, with lit candles and a bottle of wine decanting in the center. Ethan, this is... Sarah began, at a loss for words. I thought we deserved to celebrate, Ethan said softly, moving closer to her. You've worked so hard. You've brought so much to this place in such a short time. I wanted to thank you in a special way. Sarah felt her heart racing. The intimacy of the moment, Ethan's intense gaze, it was all overwhelming. Part of her wanted to let go, to enjoy this perfect moment. But another part, The part that remembered who she really was and why she was there filled her with guilt. "Ethan, she began, not knowing exactly what to say, but before she could continue, the door burst open. Robert entered the room, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "So here you are," he growled, his eyes moving between Sarah and Ethan. "I should have known. All this time, conspiring behind my back." Ethan stepped forward, placing himself protectively in front of Sarah. "Robert, this isn't what it looks like. We were simply—" "Silence!" Robert shouted, his voice resonating in the small room. "I've had enough of your excuses, Ethan. And you," he said, pointing an accusing finger at Sarah. "You've been a problem since the day you arrived." Sarah felt her stomach churn. Had Robert discovered her true identity? "I don't know what you two are up to," Robert continued, "but it's over. I've spoken with the head office. The new dishes will be removed from the menu starting tomorrow." "You can't do that," Sarah exclaimed, forgetting for a moment her role as a simple cook. "Those dishes have been a success. The customers love them." Robert looked at her with disdain. "And who are you to question my decisions? You're a simple kitchen assistant. You should be grateful to have a job." Ethan intervened, his voice tense but controlled. "Robert, you're making a mistake. These changes have revitalized the restaurant. If you eliminate them—" "If I eliminate them, what?" Robert interrupted. "Will you run and complain to Mrs. Thompson? Go ahead, do it. I'm sure the owner will be delighted to know how you've been undermining my authority." Upon hearing her own name, Sarah felt as if the ground was opening up beneath her feet. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of her control. She needed to do something, say something, but fear paralyzed her. "In fact," Robert continued, a malicious smile forming on his lips, "maybe I should inform Mrs. Thompson about your little clandestine meetings. I'm sure she'll be interested to know how her star chef is fraternizing with the staff." That was enough to snap Sarah out of her stupor. "Enough!" she shouted, surprising both Robert and Ethan. "This has gone too far." With trembling hands, Sarah removed her chef's hat and let down her hair. Taking a deep breath, she stood up to her full height and looked directly at Robert. "You don't need to inform Mr. Thompson of anything," she said, her voice firm despite the tumult of emotions inside her, "because I am Sarah Thompson." The silence that followed her declaration was deafening. Robert looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and horror, while Ethan— oh, Ethan. The expression of betrayal on his face made Sarah's heart shrink. Sarah began, but the words got stuck in her throat. How could she explain her actions? How could she justify the deception? Robert was the first to recover from the shock. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "You expect us to believe that the owner of the chain has been working as a cook? Why would you do something like that?" Sarah took another deep breath, preparing herself for the confrontation she knew was inevitable. "Because I needed to see for myself what was happening in my restaurants. I needed to understand why we were losing quality, why our employees were unhappy." She turned to Ethan, her heart breaking at the mixture of confusion and pain in his eyes. "Ethan, I'm sorry. I never meant to deceive you. Everything we shared, everything I felt, it was real." Ethan took a step back, as if Sarah's words had physically struck him. "Real," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "How can anything built on a lie be real?" Robert, regaining his composure, intervened. "This is absurd. If you really are who you say you are, then you've violated every protocol, every rule of the company. I demand that—" "You're in no position to demand anything," Sarah interrupted, her voice taking on the tone of authority she had kept hidden for weeks. "I've seen firsthand how you run this restaurant, Robert, the way you treat the staff, how you dismiss innovative ideas, how you prioritize numbers over quality and employee well-being. That ends today." Robert paled, realizing the implications of the situation. I was just following company guidelines," he stammered. "The company guidelines never included intimidation or disrespect," Sarah responded firmly. "Starting tomorrow, you'll be on administrative leave while we review your performance." Turning to Ethan, Sarah felt her resolve falter. "Ethan, I know I've hurt you, and you probably can't forgive me, but I need you to understand why I did this. This restaurant, this chain, is my life. I needed to see the truth with my own eyes. without the filters that normally surround someone in my position. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his expression indecipherable. Finally, without saying a word, he turned and left the room, leaving Sarah with a feeling of emptiness in her chest. Robert, seeing an opportunity, attempted one last act of defiance. "This won't stand. The board of directors will hear about this. You can't just—" "Enough, Robert," Sarah said, her voice tired but firm. "Go home. Tomorrow you'll receive instructions about the next steps." When Robert finally left, Sarah found herself alone in the room, surrounded by the remains of what should have been a special night. The candles were still burning, the wine still waiting to be served, but the moment had passed. Sarah sank into a chair, the weight of her actions and their consequences finally falling upon her. She had achieved her initial goal. She had seen firsthand the problems plaguing her restaurant and had identified areas for improvement. But the cost had been greater than she could have ever imagined. As tears began to fall, Sarah wondered if she could ever repair the damage she had caused, especially with Ethan. Had she sacrificed the possibility of love and trust for the sake of her business? With a trembling sigh, Sarah stood up. Tomorrow would be a new day, full of challenges and consequences. She would have to face her staff, explain her actions, and begin the arduous process of rebuilding trust. But for now, in the solitude of that room, Sarah Thompson allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, crying for what she had gained and what she feared she had lost forever. The next morning dawned grey and rainy, as if the weather reflected the mood at Golden Kitchen. Sarah arrived early, her heart heavy but her determination intact. She knew she had to face the consequences of her actions, and she was determined to do so with the same honesty and frankness she had hoped to see in her employees. When she entered the kitchen, the silence that greeted her was deafening. The employees looked at her with a mixture of amazement, confusion, and in some cases, betrayal. Emily, who had been her confidant and companion for the past few weeks, seemed especially hurt. Sarah took a deep breath and addressed the center of the kitchen. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice firm despite the lump in her throat. "I know you all have questions, and you deserve answers. I owe you an explanation." For the next half hour, Sarah shared her story. She told them about her concerns about the decline in quality and staff morale, her decision to experience life in the kitchen firsthand, and the lessons she had learned in the process. "I understand that my deception has hurt you," she concluded, her voice breaking slightly, "and I deeply regret it. It was never my intention to cause pain or distrust. I just wanted to understand, really understand, what was happening at the heart of our restaurants." The silence that followed her words was tense, laden with unexpressed emotions. Finally, to everyone's surprise, it was Jack who spoke first. "I must admit," the head chef grumbled, his usual gruffness softened by a touch of reluctant respect, "you've got guts, Ms. Thompson. Not just anyone would have done what you did." Emily stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Why didn't you trust us, Sarah? Why didn't you just ask?" Sarah felt her heart shrink at the pain in Emily's voice, because sometimes people tell us what they think we want to hear, especially when that person is the boss. I needed to see the truth for myself, without filters. Gradually, more employees began to speak. Some expressed their understanding, others their disappointment. But as the conversation progressed, Sarah noticed a gradual shift in the atmosphere. The initial tension began to dissipate, replaced by cautious optimism. "So, what happens now?" asked one of the cooks. "What will happen with the new dishes? With Robert?" Sarah nodded, grateful for the opportunity to talk about the future. "The new dishes stay," she affirmed. "They've been a success and demonstrate exactly the kind of innovation and creativity I've always wanted to foster in our restaurants. As for Robert," she continued, "as I told you yesterday, he's on administrative leave while we review his performance. But I want you to know that I'm committed to creating a work environment where everyone feels valued and respected." As the meeting came to an end, Sarah felt a cautious optimism. There was a lot of work to do, a lot of trust to rebuild, But she felt they had taken an important first step. However, there was one absence that weighed heavily on her heart. Ethan hadn't appeared all morning. After the meeting, Sarah retreated to the office that had once been Robert's. She sat behind the desk, feeling strangely out of place. For weeks, she had been one of the kitchen team, and now... A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said, secretly hoping it would be Ethan. But it was Emily who entered, her expression a mixture of determination and nervousness. "Do you have a moment?" she asked. "Of course," Sarah responded, indicating for her to take a seat. "Emily, Let me speak first." "Please," Emily interrupted. Sarah nodded, bracing herself for whatever Emily had to say. "I'm hurt," Emily began, her voice trembling but firm. "I felt betrayed when I found out who you really were, but I'm also grateful." Sarah blinked, surprised. "Grateful?" Emily nodded. "Yes, for the first time in a long time, I felt that someone really valued my ideas, my creativity. Working with you, even if it was under a false identity, made me remember why I love cooking." Tears began to form in Sarah's eyes. "Oh, Emily, I'm not finished," Emily said, raising a hand. "I want you to know that, although it will take me time to process all of this, I'm willing to move forward. I believe in your vision for this restaurant, Sarah, and I want to be part of it." Sarah stood up and walked around the desk, hugging Emily tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise I won't waste this second chance." When Emily left, Sarah felt renewed. There was a lot of work to do, many wounds to heal, but now she had hope. However, as she prepared to face the rest of the day, one thought persisted in her mind. Where was Ethan? And would she ever have the chance to explain to him, to ask for forgiveness, to tell him how she really felt? With a sigh, Sarah straightened up. One step at a time, she reminded herself. Today she had taken the first step towards rebuilding. Tomorrow, perhaps, she would have the chance to repair what she feared she had lost forever. The days that followed Sarah's revelation were a whirlwind of activity, between meetings with staff, policy and procedure reviews, and the task of reorganizing the restaurant's management structure. Sarah barely had time to breathe, let alone reflect on her personal situation. However, Ethan's absence was a constant wound, a painful reminder of what she had lost in her pursuit of the truth. Every time the kitchen door opened, Sarah couldn't help but look up, hoping to see his face. But Ethan remained absent. One afternoon, as Sarah was reviewing the new staff schedules in her office, Emily entered with a worried expression. "Sarah, I think you should know something," she said, closing the door behind her. Sarah looked up, feeling a knot in her stomach. "What's going on?" "Emily? It's about Ethan," Emily replied, sitting down across the desk. "I've heard rumors that he's been offered a position as executive chef at a luxury restaurant in New York." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Sarah felt as if the air had been expelled from her lungs. "New York?" she finally managed to say. When would he leave?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know for sure, but they say the offer is to start as soon as possible." Sarah leaned back in her chair, trying to process the information. The idea that Ethan might leave, that he might disappear from her life without even having the chance to explain herself, was unbearable. "Thank you for telling me, Emily," Sarah said, struggling to maintain her composure. I need to think about this." Emily nodded, getting up to leave. But before reaching the door, she stopped and turned to Sarah. "I know it's none of my business," she began, "but I think you should talk to him. What you two had, it was special. Even if it was built on an initial lie, the feelings were real." With those words, Emily left, leaving Sarah immersed in her thoughts. That night, after the last customer had gone and the kitchen was clean and closed, Sarah found herself wandering through the empty restaurant. Her steps inevitably led her to the small conference room where, just a few days ago, Ethan had prepared that surprise dinner they never got to share. Sarah entered the room, the memories of that night flooding her. The candles, the wine, the hope and anticipation she had felt. It all seemed so distant now. She approached the window, looking at the illuminated city beyond. Was Ethan out there, contemplating a future away from her, a future in New York, far from everything they had shared. Suddenly, Sarah couldn't bear it anymore. She took out her phone and, before she could think twice, dialed Ethan's number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Sarah was about to hang up when she heard his voice. Sarah. Her heart skipped a beat at hearing her name on Ethan's lips. Ethan, I'm sorry. I know it's late, but I needed to talk to you. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Ethan spoke. Sarah, I don't think there's anything more to say between us. Please, Sarah pleaded, her voice breaking. Just give me 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Another silence, and then a sigh. Okay, 5 minutes. Sarah closed her eyes, gathering all her courage. First, I want you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for deceiving you. I'm sorry for not telling you the truth from the beginning. But Ethan, you have to believe me when I say that everything we shared, everything I felt for you was real. How can I believe that, Sarah? Ethan responded, his voice laden with pain. How can I trust anything you tell me now? Sarah felt tears begin to fall down her cheeks, because despite everything, despite the initial lie, I showed you my true self, the Sarah you met in the kitchen, the one who worked by your side, who shared your dreams and passions, and that was the real me. Sarah, Ethan began, but she interrupted him. I know you've been offered a job in New York, she said quickly, fearing her 5 minutes were running out, and if that's what you really want, I'll understand. But before you make a decision, I'm asking you to give me a chance to show you who I really am, without lies or disguises. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Sarah held her breath, her heart beating hard in her chest. Finally, Ethan spoke. Tomorrow, he said simply. Meet me in the park across from the restaurant at dawn. We'll talk then. Before Sarah could respond, Ethan had hung up. She stood there with the phone still pressed against her ear, a mix of hope and fear swirling inside her. Tomorrow, she would have a chance tomorrow, a chance to explain, to ask for forgiveness, to fight for what she felt could be the love of her life. As she left the restaurant and headed home, Sarah knew she wouldn't sleep that night. She had a lot to think about, a lot to say. And as the city slept around her, Sarah Thompson prepared for the most important conversation of her life. Dawn arrived with a deceptive softness, bathing the park in golden and pink hues. Sarah, who had spent the night awake, arrived early. Every bench, every tree, every stone on the path seemed to vibrate with the intensity of her anticipation and nervousness. Finally, she saw him. Ethan was walking towards her, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Sarah felt her heart race, a mixture of fear and hope stirring within her. Good morning, Ethan said when he reached her side, his voice neutral, almost professional. Good morning, Sarah replied, struggling to maintain her composure. Thank you for coming. Ethan nodded, indicating a nearby bench. They sat down, a considerable space between them, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Sarah gathered the courage to speak. Ethan, Before you say anything, he interrupted, his voice soft but firm, I need you to understand something. You hurt me, Sarah, not just because of the lie, but because of the lack of trust. I thought we had something special, something real. Sarah felt tears threatening to fall, but she forced herself to hold them back. I know, and I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I fell in love with you, Ethan, and that terrified me. Ethan looked at her, surprised by her frankness. You fell in love with me? Sarah nodded, her voice breaking slightly. Yes, and that made keeping my secret even harder. Every day that passed, every moment we shared, made me want to reveal the truth. But I was also terrified of losing you. But you lost me anyway, Ethan said softly. I know, Sarah replied, tears falling freely now. And if I could go back, I'd tell you everything from the beginning. But I can't change the past. I can only ask you to give me a chance to show you who I really am. Ethan was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Do you know why I agreed to come today? He finally asked. Sarah shook her head, holding her breath. Because despite everything, despite the deception and the pain, I couldn't stop thinking about you," Ethan continued, "about the Sarah I met in the kitchen, her passion, her creativity, her kindness, and I wondered if that Sarah was real or just another illusion." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "So tell me, Sarah Thompson, who are you really?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment of truth. "I'm a woman who loves cooking with all her heart, who grew up watching her grandmother prepare dishes that made people smile. I'm someone who believes in the power of food to bring people together, to create moments of joy in the midst of life's chaos." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I'm a businesswoman who sometimes gets lost in numbers and reports, forgetting the passion that led her to create Golden Kitchen in the first place. I'm someone who made a mistake born from the desire to understand, to connect, to be something more than just a name on the door." Tears were flowing freely down her cheeks now, but Sarah made no attempt to stop them. "And I'm a woman who fell in love with a wonderful man, a man who reminded her why she loves what she does, a man whom she deeply hurt and to whom she would give anything for a second chance." Ethan looked at her in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "And the job in New York?" Sarah blinked, surprised by the question. "What?" "The job in New York," Ethan repeated. "Did you know I turned it down?" Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "You turned it down, but why?" Ethan smiled softly, the first real smile Sarah had seen on his face in days. "Because despite everything, despite the pain and confusion, I couldn't imagine leaving all this behind." "Leaving you behind?" Sarah held her breath, barely daring to hope. "Ethan, I'm not saying it will be easy," he continued. "Trust is a fragile thing, Sarah. Once broken, it takes time and effort to rebuild, but I think it's worth trying." Sarah felt her heart swell with hope. "Really? You're willing to give us another chance?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes, but this time, no secrets, no lies, just us, being honest with each other." "I promise," Sarah said fervently. "Total transparency from now on." Ethan extended his hand, taking Sarah's in his. "Then, Sarah Thompson, how about we start over? Hello, I'm Ethan, chef at Golden Kitchen, and I'm falling in love with the restaurant owner." Sarah laughed through her tears, squeezing Ethan's hand. "Hello, Ethan. I'm Sarah, the owner of Golden Kitchen, and I'm completely in love with the most talented and understanding chef I've ever met." As the sun rose in the sky, bathing the park in golden light, Sarah and Ethan moved closer to each other. Their kiss was soft, sweet, full of promises of a new beginning. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges to face, trust to rebuild, and a restaurant to transform. But as they parted, smiling at each other, they also knew they would face it together. And in that moment, in that park bathed in the light of dawn, Sarah Thompson felt she had finally found the perfect recipe: a pinch of forgiveness, a cup of honesty, and a good dose of love. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity at Golden Kitchen. With Sarah and Ethan working together openly, the restaurant experienced a transformation that went beyond the new dishes on the menu. The atmosphere in the kitchen had changed drastically. Where fear and tension once reigned under Robert's leadership, there was now an environment of collaboration and creativity. Sarah had implemented a system where all staff members could propose ideas for new dishes or improvements in processes, and Ethan led weekly culinary brainstorming sessions. Emily, who had been promoted to sous chef, was flourishing in her new role. Her creativity, previously suppressed by Robert's rigid control, now had free rein. She worked side by side with Ethan, developing new recipes that combined traditional techniques with innovative touches. Even Jack, the formerly grumpy head chef, seemed to have found a new enthusiasm for his work. Although he remained demanding, his approach had changed. Instead of shouting orders, he could now be seen patiently teaching younger cooks, sharing the tricks and techniques he had accumulated over the years. One afternoon, as Sarah watched the kitchen in full operation from her office door, Ethan approached her, a playful smile on his face. "You know, I think we should make this official," he said, handing her an apron. Sarah looked at him curiously. "Make what official?" Ethan smiled even more. "Your return to the kitchen, not as the owner, not as the boss, but as one more of the team. After all, this is where you really shone." Sarah felt a wave of emotion. The idea of returning to the kitchen, of immersing herself again in the bustle and creativity of the day-to-day, was tempting, but she also felt a twinge of doubt. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I don't want the staff to think I'm there to watch them or that I don't trust their work." Ethan took her hand, his gaze soft but determined. "Trust me, everyone has seen how much you love this. Your passion, your dedication. That's what inspired many of them in the first place. Besides," and he added with a wink, "I could use having my favorite sous chef back." Sarah couldn't help but laugh. "Sous chef, won't that bother Emily?" "Oh, Emily is more than okay with it," Ethan replied. "In fact, it was her idea." With a sigh of happiness, Sarah took the apron. "All right, chef, I'm ready to take orders." The days that followed were a rediscovery for Sarah. She re-experienced the adrenaline of a busy service, the satisfaction of a perfectly executed dish, the camaraderie that only forms in the heat of a professional kitchen. But this time, it was different. She wasn't there under a disguise, but as herself, Sarah Thompson, owner and now sous chef of Golden Kitchen. One night, after a particularly successful service, Ethan gathered all the staff. "I have an announcement to make," he began, his voice mixed with emotion and pride. "As you all know, we've been experimenting with new dishes and concepts in the last few weeks, and thanks to your hard work and creativity, we've achieved something extraordinary." He paused dramatically, building anticipation in the kitchen. "I just received a call. Golden Kitchen has been nominated for a Michelin star." The kitchen erupted in cheers and applause. Emily hugged Sarah, tears of joy in her eyes. Jack, in a rare display of emotion, threw his chef's hat in the air in celebration. Sarah was speechless. A Michelin star had been a distant dream when she founded Golden Kitchen, something she hoped to achieve someday in the distant future. And now, thanks to the changes they had implemented, thanks to the talent and dedication of her team, they were on the verge of achieving that dream. Ethan approached her, taking her hand. "This is thanks to you, Sarah," he said softly. "Your vision, your courage to challenge yourself and all of us, you've brought us to this." Sarah shook her head, emotional. "No, this is thanks to all of us. Every person in this kitchen has contributed to this achievement. We're a team, a family." That night, as the staff celebrated with an impromptu dinner after the service, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her here. From her decision to infiltrate her own restaurant to this moment of triumph, it had been an emotional roller coaster and a series of challenges. She looked around at the smiling faces of her team, at Ethan by her side, and felt a wave of gratitude and affection. Golden Kitchen had always been more than just a business for her. It was a dream, a passion, a legacy, and now finally it felt like home. As the night wore on and the celebration continued, Sarah realized that she had found something more valuable than any Michelin star. She had found her place, her purpose, and a group of people to share it with. Ethan leaned towards her, whispering in her ear, "What are you thinking about?" Sarah smiled, intertwining her fingers with his, that sometimes the most unexpected ingredients create the most extraordinary flavors. Ethan nodded, understanding the double meaning of her words, and that the most intense fire, he added, is the one fueled by passion and love. As they leaned towards each other for a kiss, surrounded by the joy and camaraderie of their team, Sarah knew she had found the perfect recipe, not just for a successful restaurant, but for a full and happy life. The road to the Michelin star would be challenging, no doubt, but with Ethan by her side and her dedicated team backing her, Sarah was ready to face any obstacle that stood in their way. After all, the best stories, like the best dishes, are created by overcoming challenges and transforming the simplest ingredients into something extraordinary. And Golden Kitchen, with its newly united family and renewed fire, was ready to shine brighter than ever. The months following the Michelin star nomination were a whirlwind of activity at Golden Kitchen. The news had leaked to the local press, and soon the restaurant was flooded with reservations and interview requests. Sarah, Ethan, and the entire team worked tirelessly to maintain the level of excellence that had brought them to this point. One afternoon, as Sarah and Ethan were reviewing the menu for that night's dinner, Emily burst into the office, her face a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "They're here!" she exclaimed, almost breathless. Sarah and Ethan exchanged looks of immediate understanding. The Michelin inspectors had arrived. "Well," said Sarah, taking a deep breath to calm herself, "this is the moment we've been preparing for. Ethan, gather the team. Emily, make sure everything in the kitchen is impeccable. I'll take care of the dining room." As they dispersed to prepare, Sarah couldn't help but feel a mix of anxiety and excitement. This was the moment that would define the future of Golden Kitchen. The night unfolded like a feverish dream. Every dish that left the kitchen was a masterpiece. Every interaction with customers was perfect. Sarah observed from a corner of the dining room, her heart beating hard every time she looked towards the table where she suspected the inspectors were seated. Hours later, when the last customer had gone and the kitchen was quiet, the team gathered in the empty dining room. The tension was palpable. "No matter what happens," Sarah began, looking at each member of her team, "I want you to know that I'm incredibly proud of all of you. What we've achieved here, what we've built together, goes beyond any external recognition." Ethan took her hand, squeezing it gently in support. "Sarah's right," he added. "We've created something special here, something that goes beyond awards or stars." Emily, with tears in her eyes, raised her glass. "To Golden Kitchen, and to the family we've formed here." Everyone joined in the toast, the clinking of glasses resonating in the empty room. At that moment, Sarah knew that, regardless of the outcome, they had gained something much more valuable than a Michelin star. Weeks later, Sarah was in her office when she received the call that would change everything. With trembling hands, she activated the speakerphone so Ethan, who was with her, could hear. "Miss Thompson," said the voice on the other end of the line, "it's my pleasure to inform you that Golden Kitchen has been awarded a Michelin star." Sarah and Ethan's shout of joy resonated throughout the restaurant. Within minutes, the entire staff had gathered in the office, hugging, laughing, and crying with happiness. That night, as the team celebrated their triumph, Sarah found herself alone with Ethan on the restaurant's terrace. "Can you believe it?" she asked, looking at the city lights. "A few months ago, I was so worried about the future of the restaurant that I disguised myself as a cook, and now—" Ethan drew her close, kissing her forehead. "And now you have a Michelin star and a team that adores you. Not bad for a few months of work, huh?" Sarah laughed, but then her expression turned serious. "You know, getting the star is wonderful, but it's not the most important thing I've gained in these months." "Oh, no?" Ethan asked, arching an eyebrow. "No," Sarah replied, looking into his eyes. "The most important thing I've gained is this. You, our team, this family we've created. That's worth more than all the Michelin stars in the world." Ethan kissed her softly, and in that kiss, Sarah felt all the love, passion, and promise of a bright future. "You know what?" Ethan said when they parted. "I think it's time we made another kind of partnership official." Sarah looked at him confused for a moment, until she saw Ethan kneeling in front of her, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Sarah Thompson," he began, his voice trembling slightly with emotion, "would you do me the honor of being my partner, not just in the kitchen, but in life? Will you marry me?" Tears were running down Sarah's cheeks as she nodded, unable to form words. "Yes," she finally managed to say. "Yes, 1,000 times yes," as Ethan slid the ring onto her finger. Sarah knew she had found the perfect recipe for happiness. A pinch of risk, a cup of passion, a handful of challenges, and above all, a good dose of love. From the terrace door, the rest of the team watched the scene, smiling and applauding softly. Emily wiped away a tear, murmuring to herself, and they lived happily and cooked ever after. And so, on the terrace of Golden Kitchen, under a starry sky that seemed to celebrate their triumph, Sarah and Ethan sealed their love with a kiss, ready to embark on their next great adventure together. The months that followed passed in a whirlwind of emotions and activity. The news of the Michelin star had catapulted Golden Kitchen to national fame, and reservations were booked months in advance. Sarah and Ethan worked tirelessly to maintain the level of excellence that had earned them recognition while planning their wedding. One afternoon, as Sarah was reviewing the final details of the tasting menu for their wedding, Emily entered her office with a concerned expression. "Sarah, there's someone who wants to see you," she said, her voice tense. Before Sarah could ask who it was, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Robert, her former manager, was there, looking much more humble than Sarah remembered. "Miss Thompson," Robert began, his voice laden with regret. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, but I needed to come and apologize in person." Sarah slowly stood up, surprised by this unexpected appearance. "Robert, Please," he interrupted. "Let me speak. I've spent the last few months reflecting on my actions, on how I handled things here, and I realized how much damage I caused, not just to the restaurant, but to the people who worked with me." Sarah listened in silence as Robert continued his apology, explaining how he had sought help to manage his stress and his tendency for excessive control. When he finished, there was a tense moment of silence in the office. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Robert, I appreciate you coming to apologize. It wasn't easy for any of us, but I think we all learned valuable lessons from that experience." Robert nodded, tears in his eyes. Thank you for listening to me, and congratulations on the Michelin star. I always knew this place had potential, I just didn't know how to harness it." As Robert prepared to leave, Sarah had a sudden idea. "Robert, wait. Would you like to stay for dinner? As a guest, of course. I think you'll be surprised to see how the restaurant has evolved." The surprise and gratitude on Robert's face were evident. I'd love to, Ms. Thompson. Thank you." That night, as Robert dined in the restaurant, Sarah observed with mixed emotions as her former manager interacted with the staff, praising the dishes and marveling at the changes. It was as if a final chapter was closing, allowing everyone to move forward completely. Weeks later, the big day arrived. Golden Kitchen closed its doors to the public for the first time since its opening, transforming into the perfect setting for Sarah and Ethan's wedding. The ceremony was intimate and emotional, with the restaurant team not just as guests, but as active participants. Emily was Sarah's maid of honor, while Jack, to everyone's surprise, officiated the ceremony, revealing a surprisingly sentimental side beneath his gruff exterior. When it came time for the vows, Ethan took Sarah's hands, his eyes shining with emotion. "Sarah," he began, "when you entered my kitchen disguised as a helper, I never imagined you'd be cooking your way into my heart. You taught me that life's best flavors come from the most unexpected ingredients. I promise to always be by your side, in the kitchen and in life, mixing our dreams and baking a future full of love and happiness." Sarah, with tears in her eyes, responded, "Ethan, you reminded me why I fell in love with cooking in the first place. You showed me that the true secret of a perfect dish isn't just in the recipe, but in the love and passion put into it. I promise to be your partner in all of life's recipes, in the sweet moments and the bitter ones, always seeking the perfect balance together." When Jack declared them husband and wife, the kitchen erupted in applause and cheers. The newlyweds' kiss was interrupted by Emily, who couldn't contain her emotion and hugged them both, initiating a group hug that soon included all the staff. The reception that followed was a celebration of love, food, and family. Each dish served told a part of Sarah and Ethan's story, from the first risotto they cooked together to an elevated version of the tiramisu that had impressed the Michelin inspectors. At the end of the night, as the last guests were leaving, Sarah and Ethan found themselves alone in the kitchen of Golden Kitchen. "You know," said Sarah, leaning on her now husband's shoulder, "when I started this adventure disguising myself as a cook, I never imagined it would end like this." Ethan hugged her, kissing her forehead. "Life has a curious way of surprising us, doesn't it? Like the best of chefs, It presents us with unexpected ingredients and challenges us to create something beautiful with them. Sarah nodded, looking around the kitchen that had been the stage for so many changes in her life. And speaking of creating something beautiful, she began with a mysterious smile on her face. Ethan looked at her, intrigued. "What are you up to now, Chef Thompson?" Sarah took Ethan's hand and gently placed it on her belly. "Let's just say we'll soon have to make room in the kitchen for a sous chef in training." Ethan's eyes widened, understanding the meaning of her words. Are we going to—" Sarah nodded, laughing at the expression of shock and joy on her husband's face. "It seems we've created more than just delicious dishes, my love." Ethan lifted her in his arms, spinning with joy in the middle of the kitchen. Their laughter and tears of happiness resonated in the space that had witnessed their love, their growth, and now, the beginning of their family. As they kissed, surrounded by the aromas and memories of Golden Kitchen, Sarah and Ethan knew they had found the perfect recipe for happiness, a recipe they would continue to perfect together, day after day, dish after dish, for the rest of their lives.